The weight of ice. The wind at Station Perseverance did not howl so much as breathe. Dr. Elias Voss had noticed this on his first night, lying awake in the narrow steel bunk while the Antarctic dark pressed against the shuttered windows like a living thing. The wind moved in long, deliberate exhalations, rising and falling, with a rhythm that was almost patient, almost human. After 3 months, he had stopped noticing it consciously, the way one stops noticing a heartbeat. But it was always there, beneath everything, and on certain nights he would wake with the sudden conviction that something enormous was sleeping just outside the walls. Perseverance was a geophysical research outpost. One of a scattered handful the American program had planted across the ice shelf in preparation for the great International Geophysical Year. It housed 6 men through the long winter, when the sun abandoned the sky entirely, and the temperature outside collapsed to depths that would freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. The station was a cluster of prefabricated huts connected by insulated tunnels, half buried in accumulated snow, so that a visitor arriving by air, had any aircraft been mad enough to attempt a landing in the polar night, would have seen only a low hummock of white, a few antenna masts, and the faint amber glow of the generator exhaust. Elias had come to measure the ice. That was the simple truth he told himself when the isolation began to work on him. He was a glaciologist, 38 years old, precise in his habits, and skeptical by temperament, and he had volunteered for this posting because the ice sheet held a record of the planet's past, written in frozen layers, and he wanted to read it. He drilled cores from the deep shelf, extracted cylinders of ancient blue ice, and studied the trapped bubbles of air that had been sealed away for 10,000 years. 20,000. More. There was something clean about the work, something that answered a need in him he could not quite name. The ice did not lie. The ice did not want anything from him. It simply was. The other men were competent enough, though he had not warmed to any of them. There was Halloran, the station leader, a heavy-set former Navy man with a bluff manner that concealed, Elias suspected, a deep anxiety about the responsibility he carried. There was Petrov, the radio man, and Dunmore, the physician, and 2 young technicians named Cobb and Ashby, who had struck up the kind of intense brotherly friendship that isolation breeds among the young. 6 men, sealed in the dark, waiting out the winter until the sun returned in September, and the relief planes could come. It was in the 7th month that things began to change. Elias first noticed it in the ice core. He had drilled to a depth of 200 meters, deeper than any core taken at the station before, and the cylinder he extracted from the barrel was unlike the others. The ice was darker, denser, and shot through with a fine tracery of what looked like fractures, except that the fractures did not behave like fractures. When he held the core up to the light of his workbench, the dark lines seemed to shift, very slightly, as though they were settling into a new configuration in response to his gaze. He blinked and looked again. The lines were still. "You're tired," he told himself, in the flat, self-correcting voice he used when his mind wandered. He had been working 18-hour days, sleeping badly, and the constant dark did strange things to a man's perception. Everyone knew that. Dunmore had lectured them all about it before the winter set in. The long night sickness, he called it, the way the mind, deprived of the sun's discipline, began to invent its own patterns in the void. Elias set the core in the cold storage locker and made a note in his logbook. He did not write down what he had thought he'd seen. He wrote only, Sample 47, depth 200 millimeters, anomalous density and inclusions. Requires further study. That night the wind breathed against the walls, and Elias dreamed of the ice for the first time. In the dream, he was standing at the bottom of his borehole, though the borehole was only a few inches wide, and he could not have fit inside it. The walls of ancient ice curved up around him into darkness, and in the ice, at the edge of his vision, there were shapes. Faces, he thought, though when he turned to look at them directly, they resolved into ordinary irregularities, air bubbles and mineral streaks. But he could feel them watching. He could feel their patience. They had been waiting a very long time, and they did not mind waiting a little longer. He woke with his heart pounding and the taste of copper in his mouth. Tahan. The omniscient eye, were it to draw back from Elias Voss and survey the whole of Station Perseverance in that 7th month, would have observed a subtle deterioration among all 6 men, each in his own way. Halloran had begun to check the door seals compulsively, walking the tunnels 3 and 4 times a night, running his gloved hands along the joints where the cold might find a way in. Petrov spent his off hours hunched over the radio, listening to the static between the scheduled transmissions from McMurdo, and though he told no one, he had begun to believe he could hear voices in the noise. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of someone trying to reach him from very far away. Dunmore drank. Cobb and Ashby, the 2 young technicians, had ceased speaking to each other after some obscure quarrel, and now moved through the station like men avoiding a shared and shameful secret. Only Elias seemed, on the surface, to be holding steady. He kept his routines. He drilled and measured and logged. But the eye that saw all things would have noticed that Elias returned again and again to Sample 47, that he spent longer and longer periods in the cold storage locker with the door shut, and that when he emerged, his face had the slack, absorbed look of a man surfacing from deep water. "You've been down in that locker a lot," Dunmore said to him one evening, in the mess hut where the men took their meals beneath a single caged bulb. The physician's eyes were red-rimmed, and there was a faint sweetness of alcohol on his breath. "That core of yours, what's so special about it?" "It's old," Elias said. "Older than anything I've measured. The layering suggests the ice at that depth formed during a period of climatic instability. There are inclusions I can't identify." "Inclusions." Dunmore turned the word over as if it tasted strange. "Like what?" Elias hesitated. He was a scientist, and scientists do not speak of impressions, of the feeling that something is watching. "Organic material, possibly," he said. "Trapped in the ice. I'd need a laboratory to be sure." "Organic!" Dunmore laughed, a short, humorless bark. "You mean something was alive down there?" "A long time ago. Bacteria, perhaps. Pollen. Nothing that would survive." But Dunmore was no longer listening. He was staring past Elias at the frost-rimed window, and his face had gone very still. "Do you ever feel," he said slowly, "that we're not alone out here? That there's something in the ice with us?" The wind breathed against the wall. "No," Elias said. "The ice is dead. That's why I came here." He did not know, as he said it, whether he was lying. The trouble with the long polar night is that it erases the ordinary markers by which a man measures his own sanity. There is no dawn to confirm that a night has passed, no dusk to mark the day's ending. There is only the artificial rhythm of clocks and schedules, and when a man's inner clock begins to drift, there is nothing in the external world to correct it. Elias had always relied on his own steadiness of mind, his ability to observe himself as coolly as he observed a sample under glass. But now that faculty was failing him, he began to lose time. The first instance was small. He went into the cold storage locker to examine sample 47, and when he came out and looked at the clock in the instrument hut, 4 hours had passed. He remembered perhaps 20 minutes of it. He remembered holding the core to the light, and he remembered, this part came to him only later, in fragments, that the dark tracery within the ice had moved, had flowed like ink in water, had arranged itself into a pattern that meant something, that was almost a word, that was on the very edge of legibility. And then there was a gap, a blankness, and he was standing at the locker door with the core still in his hands and his fingers so cold they had gone the color of tallow. He said nothing to the others. The second instance was worse. He woke in the tunnel between the sleeping hut and the mess, on his hands and knees, with no memory of how he had come there. The tunnel was dark. The string of bulbs overhead had been switched off, or had failed. And in the darkness he had the powerful, unshakable sense that he was not alone, that something was in the tunnel with him, just beyond the reach of his hands, breathing with the same slow, patient rhythm as the wind. He held perfectly still. He could hear it. He was certain he could hear it. The soft exhalation, the pause, the inhalation. And then, very faintly, he heard it speak, and the voice it spoke with was his own. "The ice remembers everything," the voice said. "It remembers you." He scrambled up and fled to the sleeping hut and lay in his bunk shaking until the artificial morning came. In the days that followed, the station seemed to contract around him. He noticed things he had not noticed before. The way Halloran watched him at meals. The way conversation stopped when he entered a room. Once he came upon Petrov and Dunmore in the radio hut, speaking in low voices, and they broke off at his approach and looked at him with expressions he could not read. Wariness, he thought, or perhaps fear. He began to suspect that the others knew something about him that he did not, that they had noticed his lost hours, his sleepwalking, and had drawn conclusions. "Is something wrong?" he asked Halloran directly one evening. "You've all been strange with me." Halloran regarded him for a long moment. His broad face was haggard, and there was something in his eyes that Elias could only call pity. "Elias," the station leader said gently, "how long do you think you've been at this station?" The question was so unexpected that Elias could not answer it. He opened his mouth and found that the number would not come. 3 months, he wanted to say. No, 7. 7 months. But the certainty dissolved even as he reached for it. How long? The days blurred. The dark was continuous. He had drilled his cores and logged his measurements, and slept, and eaten, and it might have been 3 months, or 7, or— "Long enough," he said finally, and Halloran nodded slowly, and said nothing more. The dreams grew more vivid. Each night Elias descended into the ice, and each night the faces in the walls were clearer, and the thing that waited at the bottom of the borehole was closer to the surface. He understood now that it was not many things, but one thing, one vast intelligence distributed through the entire ice sheet, ancient beyond reckoning, patient beyond human comprehension. It had slept beneath the pole for 100,000 years, and Elias's drill had woken it. It had felt his mind reaching down through the layers, and it had reached back. It wanted something from him. He could not tell what. It communicated in impressions, in floods of sensation that his human mind translated imperfectly into images and words. But the gist of it, the thing that came through most strongly, was a kind of terrible recognition, as though the ice had been waiting for him specifically, as though he belonged to it and had only forgotten. He tried to stop sleeping. He dosed himself with the coffee that Cobb brewed thick and black in the mess, and he worked through the artificial nights, and for 2 or 3 days he held the dreams at bay. But the waking world grew unreliable in their absence. He saw the dark tracery of Sample 47 in the frost on the windows, in the grain of the wooden table, in the shadows between the bulbs. He heard the slow breathing everywhere, and once, catching sight of his own reflection in the black glass of the mess window, he saw that his eyes were wrong, that they had gone flat and pale, the color of deep ice, and he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from crying out. "You have to sleep, Elias," Dunmore told him. The physician had sobered. There was a new urgency in him. "You can't stay awake forever. It'll kill you. Whatever you think is waiting in your dreams, it can't hurt you. It isn't real. Do you understand? The long night does this to men. It manufactures phantoms, but they're only in your head. You feel it too," Elias said. "I saw it in you. Weeks ago, you asked me if we were alone." Dunmore's face tightened. "I was drunk, and I was wrong. There's nothing out here but ice and cold and 6 lonely men. That's all there ever is at these stations. That's all there ever was." He gripped Elias's shoulder, and his hand was warm, shockingly warm, and Elias realized how cold he himself had become. "Sleep. Please, for your own sake, let it come, and you'll see there's nothing to it." That night, Elias slept, because he could no longer help it, and the ice took him all the way down. He stood at the bottom of the borehole, and this time the walls did not curve up into darkness. This time they were clear as glass, and beyond them, embedded in the ancient blue ice, he could see the faces at last, and he knew them. They were the faces of the men at the station. There was Halloran, his broad features slack, his eyes closed as if in sleep. There was Petrov, and Dunmore, and Cobb, and Ashby, the 2 young technicians, side by side. They were suspended in the ice, perfectly preserved, their skin the pale gray of long death, and rime crystals had formed in their eyelashes and at the corners of their mouths. They had been there a long time. They had been there, Elias understood with a slow and dreadful certainty, longer than he had been at the station. And there was one face he had not expected to see. Set apart from the others, deeper in the ice, was his own. He woke. Or he thought he woke. He was lying in his bunk, and the artificial morning had come, and the wind was breathing against the walls. He got up and dressed, and his hands were steady, and his mind felt clear for the first time in weeks, clear and cold and quiet. He walked through the tunnel to the mess hut, and the men were there at breakfast, all 5 of them, Halloran and Petrov and Dunmore and Cobb and Ashby, eating in the amber light of the caged bulb. They looked up when he entered, and in their faces he saw at last the thing he had been failing to understand for so long. "Good morning, Elias," Halloran said quietly. Elias sat down. He did not speak. He was watching them very carefully now, watching the way the light fell on them, and he saw. It was subtle. But once he had seen it, he could not unsee it. That the light passed through them. Not entirely. But at the edges, where a man's outline should have been sharp against the dark wall behind, they were faintly translucent, and the frost-glazed steel showed through, and their breath did not fog in the cold air of the hut. "You're not here," Elias said. His voice sounded very far away. "None of you are here. Are you?" Halloran set down his fork. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the station leader folded his hands on the table, and when he answered, his voice had changed. It had lost its bluff Navy heartiness and become gentle and immeasurably sad. "No, Elias," he said. "We're not." The truth came to him then, not all at once, but in a slow tide, the way the meltwater rises against the drill barrel in the spring, and the omniscient eye, which had watched Elias Voss descend through his long winter of dread, drew back at last to show the whole of it. The thing that had been true from the beginning, hidden in plain sight. There had been an accident. In the 2nd month of the winter, not the 7th. The 7th month was a fiction his mind had built to keep the truth at bay. The generator had failed. A fault in the exhaust venting, a slow accumulation of carbon monoxide through the sealed tunnels while the men slept. Halloran had died in his bunk, and Petrov at his radio, and Dunmore with a glass still in his hand, and the 2 young technicians side by side, for they had reconciled their quarrel that very night and had fallen asleep talking, as young men do, of the lives they would live when the winter ended. And Elias. Elias had not died in his bunk. Elias had woken, gasping, his head splitting, and had understood in his last coherent moments what was happening, and had staggered out through the tunnels into the polar night in a desperate, half-conscious attempt to reach the emergency generator in the outer hut. But the cold had taken him before the gas could. He had collapsed in the snow a dozen yards from the door, and the wind had breathed over him, and the ice had begun, grain by grain, to claim him. That had been 5 months ago, or 50 years ago, or 100,000. Time did not mean, in the ice, what it had meant to the living, for the ice did remember. That part had not been a phantom. The vast, cold intelligence beneath the pole was real, and it did not hunger, and it did not hate. It only gathered, the way ice gathers, accreting the dead into itself, layer upon patient layer, preserving them. It had taken the 5 men in their huts, holding them in the amber-lit tableau of their final morning, replaying it endlessly, a memory frozen and unmelting. And it had taken Elias last of all, out in the snow, and because his death had been different, because he had died reaching, striving, refusing, his memory did not settle so easily into the ice. His mind still moved. It still measured and logged and sought to understand. It had built itself a whole false winter, a story of drilling and dreaming, of Sample 47, and the thing that waited at the bottom of the borehole, because that was the only way it knew to comprehend its own slow absorption. The dreams of descending into the ice had been the truth breaking through. The lost hours had been the intervals when his frozen mind stuttered and skipped. The station had not been contracting around him. He had been thinning, dispersing, becoming ice. The core sample he had studied so obsessively. The dark tracery that seemed to move and almost form a word. That had been himself, his own reflection, staring back out of the frozen deep. The face set apart from the others, deeper in the ice. "You knew," Elias said to the pale gathering of his crewmates. "All of you. You were trying to tell me." "We were trying to help you rest," Dunmore said. The physician's translucent eyes were kind. "It's easier once you stop fighting it. You've been fighting it so long, Elias. Longer than any of us. You always were the stubborn one." A ghost of a smile. "The ice doesn't lie. You said that yourself. It simply is. And now you are, too. That's all. That's all it is." Elias looked down at his own hands on the table, and he saw the frost blooming across the backs of them, the rime crystals forming in the fine hairs, and he felt no fear. The dread that had ridden him through the long false winter was draining away, and in its place came something like the clean, cold quiet he had always sought. The reason, he understood now, that he had come to the ice in the first place. He had wanted a thing that did not want anything from him. He had wanted a silence that did not lie. He had found it. He had found it before he ever arrived, perhaps. Perhaps he had been seeking his own death all along, and the ice had only given him what he came for. The wind breathed against the walls. It was not the wind. It had never been the wind. It was the ice, breathing, patient, and it was breathing now for him. The long, slow exhalation, the pause, the inhalation, drawing him down at last into the layers where the others waited, where the record of the world was written, and where he would become a line in that record, a thing measured rather than measuring. "Stay with us," Ashby said, the younger of the two technicians, and there was a loneliness in it that pierced whatever remained of Elias's heart. "Yes," he said. "All right." He closed his eyes. The amber light of the mess hut dimmed and went blue, the deep, unfathomable blue of ancient ice, and the faces of his crewmates blurred and softened around him like reflections in still water. He felt himself settling, the way a snowflake settles, joining the countless others, losing his edges, becoming part of the great slow gathering that had waited beneath the pole since before there were men to freeze and be remembered. The last thing to go was the measuring instinct, the scientist's need to know. And in the final instant before it dissolved, Elias Voss understood the thing the ice had been trying to tell him all along, the word the dark tracery had almost formed. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was the simplest word there is, the word that ice speaks to everything it touches, given time enough and cold enough and patience enough. Stay. In September, when the sun returned and the relief plane at last set down on the sea ice near Station Perseverance, the men who came found the station dark and silent, the generator long dead, the tunnels sheathed in a fine glittering frost. In the mess hut, they found 5 bodies, seated calmly at the table, perfectly preserved by the cold, their faces peaceful in the amber-tinted light that the plane's crew brought with them. The medical examiner would later record the cause of death as carbon monoxide poisoning, and would note with some unease that the men appeared to have died all together in the midst of an ordinary breakfast, without alarm or struggle. A 6th man was missing. They found him 3 days later, when the drifted snow was cleared from around the outer huts, a figure curled in the ice a dozen yards from the door, one arm outstretched toward the generator he had not reached, his features locked in an expression the examiner could not quite classify, not terror as one might expect, but something closer to recognition, closer to peace. The identification card in his frozen pocket named him Dr. Elias Voss, glaciologist. They chipped him free of the ice with some difficulty, for he had been there a long time, and the sheet had begun to take him. And in the borehole beside him, where his drill still stood in its frozen barrel, one of the crewmen found a single ice core, extracted from a great depth and left standing in the snow. He held it up to the low September sun, curious, and for a moment, only a moment, and he told no one, he thought he saw, in the fine dark tracery within the ancient blue ice, the suggestion of a face. A man's face, calm and cold and patient, looking back at him from somewhere very deep and very far away. Then the light shifted, and it was only ice, and the crewman set it down and went to help the others, and the wind came up off the great white sheet, and breathed its long, slow breath across the station, patient as it had always been, and would always be.